not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light, and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his holy word.
I invite you to pray with me in a slightly different way from usual. I invite you to open your heart in prayer. Breathe in slowly, breathe out slowly, and join with me in saying, breathe on us, breath of God. Breathe on us, breath of God. Amen. My sermon this morning comes from questions I heard from you. In gratitude to your sharing what's important to you with me, I have written it out word by word, which is not usual for those of you who know me well. This will be on our website. I can also make copies for you if you'd like to take it with you. This is in response to a question about how we share grace with compassion. The Israelites wandered through the wilderness, mumbling against their leadership, doubting God's call on Moses and Moses' ability to plan for their future. God sweetens their water, provides them with food. God makes their circumstances easier, but also disciplines them. Then the day comes when the Israelites speak not only against Moses, but against God as well. This time, punishment comes quickly in the form of deadly snakes. And the scripture, Numbers 21:6 says, so that many Israelites died. The people, shocked by the consequences of their mumbling, are humbled and go to Moses to admit their grave mistake. And the Lord, quote, and the Lord said to Moses, make a poisonous snake and place it on a pole. Whoever is bitten can look at it and live. Moses does this, making a snake out of bronze, and it works just like God said. It's okay, honey. Humankind has not grown out of our difficult times. We have not completely armored ourselves against doubt. Every day, people still suffer, worry, stress out, and grieve. It's present here this morning. In the worst of times, it can take super strength to turn to each other rather than withdrawing and numbing out. In order to be healed, each Israelite had to look at the snake. They had to choose to look at the snake. In some ways, looking at that snake was more difficult and more honest than wailing rehearsed and empty pleas as what they might have thought of as a demanding and strange God. God was interested in the kind of change that would come from facing oneself and the source of harm with open eyes. That change could only happen by personal choice. In order to be healed, each Israelite had to choose to look at the snake. The snake on the pole was fake. It was just bronze. But the reckoning was real. The healing happened in the decision to face the facts of what was going on. And what was going on? What were the facts? This generation of Israelites was helpless in the wilderness. They had come out of town, out of the city. They gave up easily, they refused to adapt, and they had no way of capitalizing on any of their assets. They were not built for this. The source of their survival and the value of their lives depended on their relationship with God. Grace preceded and provided for them free and abundant, and promised to lead them home. Their reluctance to recognize and trust that grace threatened their survival as an entire people. God had promised to be faithful to them. God demanded that they learn to see. It is no surprise then that when John seeks to describe why the symbol of death and resurrection of Christ is important in the life of faith, he references the snake story. We too must be taught to see grace at work in the world and in our lives. We can't adopt this awareness from someone else, just borrow the faith of other people, or get by with rote gestures toward a God who remains a stranger. Each of us receives restorative wholeness by facing ourselves as participants in a relationship with God. It's not a lonely thing. Right? What we choose has real consequences for our shared future. Moses made a bronze snake that stood for the poisonous relationship between the Israelites and God's healing grace. In John's Gospel, we realize that Christ came to die on the cross as the sign of how broken and dead we have become. Christ came to awaken our sight because of God's love for us. It was an act of forgiving and renewing. Our cross is just wood. And the original cross was just plain. But that doesn't matter. Because each of us is invited to look to the symbol of the cross and see that grace is real for us as well. This is not to say we always can or will. It doesn't mean that it will happen on a neat timetable or in ways that we can predict or control. It doesn't mean that we will never lose sight of it once we see it. And many times we will face the challenges of life and family together, but from different perspectives on grace. Another troubling part of the snake story is the loss of so many, even after the bronze snake was lifted. What happens to the families for whom some are bitten and look, and some are bitten and just can't? What about those who are in such agony that they can't focus their eyes on the signs of grace? What about those for whom this healing happens very slowly or in fits and starts? We aren't meant to segregate into classes of faith, but to love one another. Christ gave us the example of walking together in love. You heard Jim say, John reading, Christ came not to condemn the world. How do we lovingly share our trust in grace? Become Christ for others. With those who are struggling to see. I have 4 suggestions. These are suggestions that I'm living by and praying over, and I fail and I fall, but I offer them in hopes that they might help. The first is to cultivate compassion, but remain or return to yourself. I want to share with you an excerpt from the book, I Like You. It's a children's book. It's by Sandal Stoddard Warburg, and it comes in the form of a poem. I'm only going to read part of it for you now. It says, and I like you because when I'm feeling sad, you don't always cheer me up right away. Sometimes it's better to be sad. You can't stand the others being so googly and gaggly every single minute. You want to think about things. It takes time. I like you because if I'm mad at you, then you are mad at me too. It's awful when the other person isn't free. They're so nice and hoo-hoo, you can just punch them in the face. I like you because if I think I'm going to throw up, then you are really sorry. You don't just pretend that you were looking at the birdies and all that. You say, maybe it was something you ate. You say, the same thing happened to me one time, and the same thing did. Compassion requires that we see the ways we are the same and recognize that each of us is beloved by God and has sacred worth. Compassion makes it possible for us to respect each other's sadness enough to let it be in shared silence. Compassion helps us remember that the same thing happened to us one time. Compassion helps us to value each other enough that we run the risk of offending and being offended, and it also helps us practice forgiveness. Compassion is not throwing out our joy to take over someone else's sadness. We can make room for others' feelings without crowding out our own truth. This is difficult, and it takes practice. But it is important, because habitually adopting someone else's grief or fear is not loving. It is performing, play acting. It turns our relationships false. Whereas witnessing to hope, grounded in personal knowledge of grace, is servant-hearted and open to complex truth, open to silence and time. My second suggestion is that we remember that grace is free for and from us. Grace is free in the sense that we don't earn it. It's also free in the sense that we don't control it. Loving relationship and true community demands that we show up and be ourselves, even when we feel unfinished or uncertain. So often we can resist the call to reach out because we don't know the right things to do or the right things to say. We don't want to badger our neighbors, and we may begin to feel like we must be doing the wrong thing if our actions don't seem to get results. We have justified fear of being rejected as hypocrites. We are not hypocrites if we share hope from our personal knowledge of grace. Pretend joy or repeating the stories of others in place of our own story opens our relationships to falsehood. Telling our true stories and revealing the joy that springs from renewed hope opens our relationships to real transformation. Remember, we are not the ones to dole out grace. God will reveal grace through us, whether or not we say the right things, and no matter how long or how many intertwining relationships it takes. Our goal should be to become ready and resilient volunteers. My third suggestion is to keep trying. God ended up using a bronze snake with the Israelites because the many previous attempts did not work. Many Jesus followers despaired when he was crucified. What seems like failure in the short term might be part of a longer success story. Sometimes our attempts to be loving, compassionate, and honest witnesses result in embarrassing mix-ups or angry confrontations. If this happens to you, it doesn't mean that you are done. Say you wound a grieving friend, and he slams the door in your face. If the two of you are going to heal, you're going to have to be willing to come back and knock on that door. Bad experiences are much less damaging if they are surrounded with good ones, or even neutral ones. Keep trying. My final suggestion is that we let the intention drive the action. In a message about real and fake, this is a crucial point. We can get tight but not trying to think of what is the right thing for our neighbor and never do anything at all. Or we can depend on pre-approved options designed by commercial interests or on social etiquette gurus whose job it is to merely prevent personal embarrassment or offense against acquaintances. We have to be aware of applying cheap balm that doesn't heal. Neither of those responses testify to the saving power of the grace we have received. They are hollow interactions and do not help to guide us in loving one another. Still, whatever we do, even if it is in error, too much, too little, premature, belated, relying on the resources of others, or emerging from our own lips, we do it with the intention of loving and sharing healing grace. And God can use that for good. We never know how another person will receive us and our actions. We cannot predict which gestures will inflame and which will soothe. Beginning with compassion, we must trust the worthiness of our best efforts. Even if the best we can offer are a few corny cliches. Even if what we say rings false in our ears. I firmly believe that the truth of the love and hope behind our words will transform our offering into a real witness of grace. Now, I know we've already been here for an hour this morning. I would like to conclude by grounding this witness in a testimony from my own experience. When I returned from my field education term in Africa, I was a broken person. I had sunk into an incapacitating depression. And I was returning to a life in Boston that had been ripped apart by my leaving. Beautiful new things were taking root in my life, but I had no way of knowing it then. I couldn't look friends in the eye, and I had a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. I felt estranged from my family and friends, and I was flat broke. I did a variety of things to change my situation, and eventually I was able to heal and to grow. I still think of that whole period with gratitude. It was one of the most important in my life so far in terms of my personal formation. But God willing, I will never forget what got me out of bed and back to class on that first day, before I had anything else. The phone rang. I answered it reluctantly. I was still adjusting to the time difference, and like I said, I was feeling very low. I heard over the voice of the scratchy connection a young Catholic seminarian with whom I studied, and he was calling me from the village from which I had just returned. He called me by a nickname and asked me about my flight home. He laughed and wished me a good morning. He said nothing unique or special. If anything, our conversation was brief and kind of awkward. But that phone call helped me face the next day, and then the next, until other joys began to return. The ministry we are talking about this morning is hard work, and it involves a lot of trust. It means usually not knowing what kind of effect you're having, and facing down many fears about phoniness and magical thinking. Moses might never have known how many poisonous bites were given and how many Israelites were saved by a fake snake on a pole. Still, he trusted the very real grace of God to do the good work God had promised. And he trusted it enough to let it lead him. I pray that your sight will be clear, your courage great, as you testify to grace with your lives in this aching world. May it be so. I invite us to prepare our hearts to make our offering of ourselves to God.